So, another solo episode for me at Keen on Yoga. Welcome. Hope your new year is going well so far. And what have I got to say other than that? Well, nothing much really. Some workshops in Europe coming up in the spring, and retreat in Bali. And very excited actually to say I'm doing a Bhagavad Gita course. So trying to make the Bhagavad Gita, which is a text that I've loved, absolutely loved over the years actually. If you know anything about me and my teaching, much more than the Yoga Sutras. The Yoga Sutras is a very interesting text, but perhaps the Bhagavad Gita is really where we can find real life instruction, sensible instruction for really like living in the world, not transcending the world. And I'm excited to say that that has finally been done by me and ready to go. And it'll be, I think, in March, end of February, start of March that we're doing the course, a few weekends. Join, sign up. You don't have to be on the video all the time. You can join sometimes and listen to the rest on video, ask your questions. It's a discussion after all. What we're trying to do is discuss this stuff together. There'll be a book, a particular translation of the book that I suggest. And if you can get that, if you can't, then just read the book that you have. And we're just going to discuss the points after I give a little brief kind of introduction to each chapter. So we'll actually read the whole thing as well, not together in the class, but read it through beforehand and discuss. And you'll get a good overview of the text, which is a really practical basis altogether for what we can call yoga philosophy, Hinduism, etc., etc. These days, it just gives a good, kind of covers a lot of bases there for yoga philosophy in general. So it's a really good place to start. Anyway, today I'm going to have another go. I think I've done this once already. I'm going to have another go at the modern history of yoga. So starting from the 20th century, how things developed, how we've got so many postures. When prior to the 1850s, we really didn't have many postures. If we look at the 1850s, before the 1850s, in a text called the Hatha Vyasa Paddhati, which actually engages the reader with, I think, about 120 or so posture. I could look at my notes somewhere. No, around 120 postures anyway. 112 postures. Before that point, and that was roughly in the 1850s, we had Hatha Yoga texts, Tantric texts, which are something like the Hatha Pradipika, Pradipika, and such texts, Korunta Samhita, Dattatreya Yoga Shastra, all these Shiva Samhita, Ashtanga Bhagavad Gita, all these old tantric texts that you can read and they're perfectly readable. I mean, it's not that, they've been translated obviously from Sanskrit, otherwise they might not be readable to you, certainly not to me, but they don't really express what we're doing now. So it's a bit confusing when people often have said to me, read, if you're doing Hatha Yoga, you have to, the Pradipika is your Bible. But then you go and look at it and it's like, well, actually there's a lot of kriyas, to cleansing practices. And there's a few asanas, 15 in total. And then there's a whole bit at the end about meditation and Raja Yoga, the yoga of meditation, the highest yoga, Kundalini and that kind of thing. It doesn't really give a kind of, it was a bit disappointing, to be honest. It doesn't really give a clear instruction to modern asana. So I think I spent my life's works really, trying to kind of say what we're doing now in terms of finding precedents to prior existent text. And, much like as we'll see Krishnamacharya did himself in the early 20th century, to try to plug in what we're doing now and say, well, this is a modern version. It's a modern version, but we need to use modern terminology and say it in our own way and realize that some things are adapted, right? We're no longer probably looking for a transcendent Kundalini experience, for example, which was prior to 1900s, 1800s, but previously, yogis in caves, ascetics, sadhus, however you want to call them, were really practicing for that transcendental experience, right? And now, living in the world, having not rejected the world, living somewhat materially, with a family, with probably sometimes, with job, probably sometimes, and commitments, definitely. We have stuff to do, and maybe we don't want to spend our lives in samadhi. And essentially, that's what Krishnamacharya was saying. Anyway, so we should get to that really. But this little chat, this little podcast, is trying to kind of fumble around really. And I'm not a yoga academic, if you hadn't noticed. I'm not a scholar in any form or fashion. So if I make mistakes, please feel free to correct me. This is probably not 100% perfect, but I try my best in terms of who I've talked to and what I've read to put together my own version of, what happened? Where do we get all these asanas and what do they mean now? And how are they related to the past? So, starting from the start, we have the history, we have the myth of the Yoga Korunta and the Rama Mohan Brahmacharya, Krishnamacharya's guru, and his 5 years in Tibet in the Himalayas, learning the asana. And then he says, well, he learnt it all out of this Yoga Korunta, And he comes back, and the Rama Mohan Brahmacharya, his guru, says, well, you should take a wife, have a family, and teach yoga as your payment to me. Traditionally, the guru-disciple relationship, at the end, the guru can ask for whatever they want. So beware, if you've ever taken a guru, there's payback time. At the end, they can ask you to do whatever they want you to. And so, allegedly, that's what he says to Krishnamacharya. But really, when we look for this Yoga Korunta, no one's ever found it. And people say that a figure called Kuruntaka wrote the Hatha Paddhati, but the Hatha Paddhati doesn't exactly reflect the Ashtanga sequences anyway. So before probably getting further, we should say that the Korunta is the basis of the claims on Ashtanga Yoga for the traditionality of the method of Pattabhi Jois's Ashtanga Yoga, because he would say that the sequences were in the Yoga Korunta. But of course, we haven't seen the Korunta. Apparently it was eaten by rats or mice or ants, whichever animal you prefer. It was in the Calcutta Library, apparently. Apparently, Pattabhi Jois had gone to see it with Krishnamacharya, which seems also like a tall story. The dates don't really work for Krishnamacharya's being in the Himalayas in the first place, and this is not my synopsis of that. This is scholars saying that, actual academics have looked at dates, except it seems kind of unlikely. Norman Soyman, in his book Traditions of the Mysore Palace, I've interviewed Norman. You can listen to that podcast. It's way back, but you can listen to it. He suggests that Krishnamacharya actually didn't go outside the state of Karnataka to learn asana. Krishnamacharya also says in Sringari, I think in a temple in Sringari, which is a few hours outside Mysore, he falls down after hiking there all day as a boy. There's a young teenage boy, about 18 I think he was, and he has a vision. Natha Muni, a dead sage of the 1200s, I'm going to say, gives him the Yoga Rahasya, a lost text that gives him loads of stuff on yoga. So he says that was revealed, and that's also a source of his teaching. Because in the Yoga Makaranda of Krishnamacharya, there's a bibliography. And in the Makaranda, first, he doesn't actually mention the Korunta at all. That comes later. But he does mention the Yoga Rahasya, which is a revealed text to him. So that's one source of where he says the postures came to him in a vision, which is convenient. But, not being cynical, I think that we find in the 20th century the need to innovate, right? Because, as I said, Hatha Yoga, the traditional tantric text of Hatha Yoga, they don't really have many postures. They certainly don't have upward or downward dog. They don't have many dynamic postures, many standing postures. And then suddenly we get to the 1850s, the Hatha Paddhati, and I'm going to do a podcast on these ones next, which is a little bit more complicated. But the Hatha Yoga project, and Jason Birch on his own as well, the Hatha Yoga project being Daniela Bevilacqua, Jim Mallinson, and Jason Birch, they embarked in this question, trying to find out the origins of Hatha Yoga. Where did it come from? And Jason Birch subsequently has published a number of things on his own about looking at the Hatha Paddhati as a text that gave rise to the Sri Tattva Nidhi, which is a later pictorial text, and that was in around the 1850s. But I think the Paddhati was earlier, and he found the Paddhati after looking at the Tattva Nidhi. In fact, the aforementioned Norman Soyman, he went to his house and he was rumbling in the attic, and you can hear this podcast with Jason Birch when he mentions the fact that he discovered that there was a text that Norman Soyman photographed in the Mysore Palace, and that was in the 1850s. Norman Soyman wasn't there in the 1850s. The text was in the 1850s. And there Norman Soyman says, look, these pictures here suggest a dynamic asana flow, right? And prior to that, all we'd had is the myth of the Yoga Korunta. That's where it all came from. So Norman Soyman got into trouble with certain Ashtanga literalists to suggest that there was this text that wasn't the Korunta that maybe Krishnamacharya had borrowed from. And then Jason Birch came along later, and he was trying to find a precedent for the Tattva Nidhi. Obviously, the Tattva Nidhi had to have come from somewhere, probably just didn't arrive on the table out of nowhere. And after all, the Maharaja of Mysore had commissioned the Tattva Nidhi, one Maharaj, not the 20th century Maharaj, but the prior Maharaj had commissioned this Tattva Nidhi to represent Hatha Yoga. So they must have come from somewhere. And so Jason happened to find he found some slides from Norman Soyman that suggested that he saw another manuscript somewhere after Norman had been photographing all these slides in the Mysore Palace. Yeah. And then Jason Birch traced this text and found that there was a text that looked very much like it had given birth to the Tattva Nidhi, and it contained slightly more postures, but most interestingly, and it was not that far in terms of time-wise prior to the Tattva Nidhi. Yeah, but most interesting, the Hatha Bhyasa Padati. So just to get this clear, we have the Hatha Bhyasa Padati, gave birth to the Tattva Nidhi, and a couple of other texts along around those times. Nothing prior, I think, so far before the Hatha Bhyasa Padati, but probably there is a precedent. Yep. But it certainly is around the ages. Anyway, the interesting thing, the Tattva Nidhi gives pictorial representations of asanas, and they're dynamic. That's the interesting thing. They're quite challenging asanas, and they seem that they might be in a flow, that there might be a movement between one to the other because of the way they're structured, right? So therefore, this idea that, you do have a record of vinyasa before the static postures of tantric yoga, because again, prior to that, if we look at the Pradipika, such text, all tantric texts, static postures, a few postures, and pranayama. Yeah, that's all there is. And the bandhas, Mahabandha, Mahamudra, Mahaveda, the three major bandhas, pranayama, a few asanas to raise kundalini. Sounds very different to what Krishnamacharya is teaching, what we're probably practicing today. So the Hatha Bhyasa Padati, the Tattva Nidhi, they give more postures, a lot more postures. And they're dynamic ones. And they're linked with movement. And the Bhyasa Padati, more than the Tattva Nidhi, suggests that there is a certain order to do them in, that there is a right certain order. So then you have the idea of Vinyasa Krama. Ashtanga, for example, is based upon that you should do postures building up in a certain way. But on the other hand, they're not the Ashtanga sequences, so we don't have that to claim the basis of Ashtanga from. But nevertheless, there is this record before the 20th century that Krishnamacharya would have had probably these texts to hand, because of course he was teaching in the Mysore Palace in 1928, I believe. He's given a little room in a wing of the Jagan Mohan Mysore Palace. It's not there's two Mysore palaces. Yeah. So one palace, Maharaja Mysore at the time, gives them a little room and suggests that he teach asana to the boys of Mysore. Not their boys, not all boys, Brahmin boys, and only boys. So it's a little bit elitist in the first place, of course. But the project of the Maharaja has to be said. It is to introduce physical culture to the people of India around Mysore and the surrounds, and indigenous physical culture, because obviously they were occupied by the British at that time. So they were well used to physical culture coming from the West, gymnastics, military training. But of course, India had its own indigenous traditions, wrestling, dance, and asana. And the Surya Namaskar practice, which is a slightly different practice as well, probably with Vedic origins. And we'll come to that podcast in a few podcasts' time. I've got that already as well to go. Anyways, so Maharaja of Mysore, he was a political figure, and he was very vested in overthrowing the British, trying to campaign for Swaraj, Indian independence, self-rule. So he was using his influence to engage the public with figures like Krishnamacharya to spread the idea that you had a strong indigenous culture that could give rise to strong men that had confidence and determination and self-determination, i.e. they could rule themselves, right? The idea prior to this, although it sounds strange in the modern day, was with the British subjugating the Indians, there was this idea of kind of, how do you say, just subjugating them, making them feel we can't say gender-wise these days, but emasculated, i.e., that's kind of irrelevant to say these days, but right, like not strong, not whether male or female, not strong or able to rule themselves, right? So giving this idea that they can do something strong that is theirs, that is not from the British, right, is very important. And that's where Krishnamacharya finds himself at the start of the 20th century and in need of a job. After all, he's got a big family. I think he had 8 kids to support, and he's kind of fallen on hard times, even though Krishnamacharya had a number of basically the equivalent of PhDs, very, very learned kind of guy, right? And all the yoga stuff going on, right? For some reason, he rejects job. He's actually, family-wise, he's meant to have a job running. He's at the head of an important monastery, but he rejects that. And instead, he works as a coffee plantation supervisor, booming in the hills outside Mysore, so not close to his family, away a lot of the time, and obviously way under his capabilities, right? So when the Maharaja of Mysore gives him this job, now obviously he wants to take it, and really the mantle is, he doesn't want Hatha Yoga, traditional Hatha Yoga, the boys sitting around doing a few breathing postures. He wants something strong, something dynamic, something that he can show. And so therefore, Krishnamacharya often has the responsibility of doing yoga demonstrations in public to show off this vital, strong, impressive indigenous form, right? It's all part of the backdrop of this political situation that Indian people find themselves in at the start of the 20th century. And also, it's very important to recognize that next door to Krishnamacharya, there was another room. And this room was taken by K.V. Iyer, the famous, around that Bangalore, Mysore area bodybuilder. He was a bodybuilder, but also one with holistic aspirations. He was involved with yoga as well, with other forms of, let's say, holistic calisthenics, like how do you say this? Where you train with your own body weight, right? Body weight training, like not just weight training, but body weight training, right? And he was also, this is KV, in the room next door to Krishnamacharya. Yep, he was also working with Sitharam Sundaram, who was the first guy to publish a yoga manual in the early 1910, 1920. Sorry, I should know the date for that. But he was the first one to ever publish, I think, a modern yoga manual showing a bunch of postures, how to do them, their benefits, a kind of precursor, if you like, to the light on yoga. So Sitharam Sundaram was working often in conjunction with K.V. Iyer, and K.V. Iyer also had to do demonstrations, right? So he also had to go, he was asked by the Maharaja of Mysore to go around and promote his craft, because he was given this room, right, and the patronage of the Maharaj, who paid the money, right? So there was a certain demand on the way that they taught, right? And I'm sure it can't be missed by Krishnamacharya that there was like all this other physical culture going on next door. So in the first place, of course, you have these texts in the Mysore library that Krishnamacharya would have had access to, the Vyasa Paddhati, the Tattva Nidhi, and the Vyayamadapike. The Vyayamadapike was a gymnastics manual, late 1800s, I believe, written by someone who has a long name, who I can't quite remember. Sorry, it should be again in my notes, but sure you can find that. And this gymnastics manual was also trading. It was like trading on the past, right? They often do this, a synopsis of different ideas in one text, right? They're constantly kind of updating a tradition. That's very important in many cultures and in the Indian culture. So the Vyayamadapike was probably also a definitive, somewhat influential text on Krishnamacharya, because it used this jumping movement, the joku. The joku looks very much like a jump back, jump through, and it's in this text, as well as other body weight-bearing ideas. So there's text in the Mysore Palace Library. They don't go back that far. And of course, the idea of Krishnamacharya's claiming an older tradition was natural. As a traditional Brahmin, he couldn't say, this all came from, texts in the 1850s. Of course, he wanted to find an older linking to something more traditional, more in line with the roots of yoga. But nevertheless, he was probably influenced by these other people, namely V.K. Iyer and the other texts in the Mysore Palace Library, and other people say, like Mark Singleton, influenced by Western bodybuilding training, calisthenics, Eugene Sandow being an important influence. He was a bodybuilder. Henrik Ling would be another one. And then harmonial gymnastics, Genevieve Stebbins. There's a bunch of people that, again, you could read Mark Singleton's Yoga Body, that Krishnamacharya may have been influenced to or exposed to, probably via the gym next door to him. To be honest, KV was somewhat influenced by these people. But I think that's an unnecessary kind of conflictive or incendentary statement to make. I don't think that Krishnamacharya needed to be influenced by Western movement modalities. I think I think that confuses the issue. I think there was already enough. Granted that the asanas probably weren't all written down on stone tablets and found around the time of the Pashupati seal, 2000 BC, which is somewhat a claim these days that modern Hindutva makes about yoga, that it was all thousands of years old and contained in the Vedas or something like that, which it wasn't. Nevertheless, we don't need to say whatsoever that yoga comes from the West, right? I think there may have been influences on it, but I think that you've got enough indigenous culture in India to give rise to yoga asana. Look at the carved, how do you call them, statues that you find on many Indian temples. There's a few particularly Indian temples that show dance, ancient dance, and they look very much like yoga postures. I shouldn't again know the particular temples, but they're well known, right? So you have Indian traditional dance, giving rise possibly to yoga asana, and also wrestling, right? The jump back, jump through looks a bit like a dand and a bettock. There's a guy called, I forget his first name, Joseph Alter. I did a podcast with him a while back, and Joseph Alter talks about the influence of Indian wrestling in our podcast together. And the dands and bettocks look, very much like a kind of Surya Namaskar warm-up. They look like the linking that Krishnamacharya puts within his postures. But again, Krishnamacharya had to find a reasoning. He had to find a reasoning, because otherwise you may as well just been teaching gym. On the other hand, in fact, it did look like he may have had other influences even when he was teaching in the Mysore Palace, because if you look at the photo in Norman Soimon's book, which is quite a famous photo of Krishnamacharya's Shala in the Mysore Palace, there's like a chest expander and some ropes and other kind of a couple of extraneous pieces of gym kit in there as well. I think we have to recognize that Krishnamacharya was heavily innovating, but within a traditional precedent nonetheless. Being a traditional Brahmin and very scholarly, he found ways to link it to the past, and there were texts that did link him to the past, but they also don't date back. It would be nice to find a lineage that goes back to the Hatha Pradipika and forward all the way from Krishnamacharya, and maybe before the Hatha Pradipika. Of course, it would be great to find a lineage that went back all the way to the times of classical yoga and prior to classical yoga, that showed all the asanas and gave a detailed explanation of how they fitted into a full practice using pranayamas and, even the whole idea of Patanjali's yoga, right? The asana. You have this big tradition of asana that goes back to Patanjali. That would be great, wouldn't it? And Patanjali suggests that you practice all these asanas like we do today, as well as the pranayamas and the pratyahara, and the whole thing fits together all the way from back then. But of course it doesn't, because Patanjali only includes, I think, 5 asanas, and they're all sedentary postures to basically meditate in. So he's really not interested in asana. In the Bhagavad Gita, we find Krishna just saying to Arjuna, you should go often to retreats on your own in the forest, where you sit with a spine straight and breathe equally through both nostrils. But he's not talking about doing any asanas either. So it's only later in the 8th century that we start to hear of more asanas, and then only then they refer to many asanas, but they only actually suggest 10 or 12, I think, if you're looking back to early tantric texts. And again, they're really sedentary as well. They're not really challenging. It's only in the Hatha Pradipika in the 15th century that we find Peacock Mayurasana included. That's often included actually in tantric texts, but the rest of them are like more or less meditational postures in a certain sense, right? And again, the whole idea is that Kundalini, the bandhas, the pranayamas, and the raising of Kundalini. So if we take the Kundalini off the table and look at our modern asanas as an energetic practice, if we're looking for making asana an energetic practice, we have to somewhat do what Krishnamacharya did and synthesize a bit, make a kind of synthesis or systematize what's come before. And Krishnamacharya really did that, right? He was asked to teach something that was spectacular for the general public, to raise morale in a political context to the Indian public, but he was also wanting to do something obviously traditional as well. So he looked to older texts and also tried to synthesize Patanjali in there. Although Krishnamacharya didn't call his yoga Ashtanga yoga, he called it Yoga Korunta, actually. So he's obviously, this Yoga Korunta comes somewhere, but he also tried to, if you look at the Yoga Makaranta, his first book, he tries to bring Patanjali in there, and the yamas and niyamas. He talks about them. He talks about yoga being no good at all if you're not practicing yama and niyama. He also talks about the Patanjali idea that you do asana and then you progress, the idea of the ladder, that it's a progression. In fact, asana is first, but then it's for the sake of pranayama being for the sake of dharana being for the sake of meditation, dhyana, right? So it's a ladder. So he also talks about that idea, but it's also contradictory, because another point, Krishnamacharya in Makaranda talks about tantric yoga, that actually the asanas have a energetic component in and of themselves, that they're not just an ascendant ladder for meditation, right? So he does kind of try and bring in a kind of systematize all the traditions in a sense that have gone before. Even Ayurveda, which has a huge tradition often linked to yoga, he even brings in the idea that yoga can also be used to cure physical health complaints. So he's got an Ayurvedic school or kind of lineage coming in there as well, right? So classical yoga he brings in, Patanjali, classical yoga ideas, in fact, of devotional ideas, I would say are more classical yoga, and then Patanjali, who's kind of classical and kind of his own thing in the Ashtanga yoga, then Ayurveda, then Tantra, right? And he's trying to bring all these things in together in the Yoga Makaranda, which is at least the record that we have of his teaching. Because when we looked at individual figures for word of mouth explanation of what he taught in the Mysore Palace, or you have Pattabhi Jois saying that he taught him the Yoga Korunta, the sequences, which is not the occasion. It's likely the sequences were probably put together as just example sequences for the sake of demonstration for the general public. I've mentioned this many times. This is the best explanation of Ashtanga yoga we have, as Pattabhi Jois taught it, that Pattabhi Jois was one of the head boys for Krishnamacharya and would lead the demonstrations that Krishnamacharya was asked to do by the Maharaja in the general public, at which time he would some of the things that he did in the Mysore Palace. Because in the Mysore Palace, there was no set sequences. Dr. Sharma, TKV Sharma, is famously said on record, Andrew Epler, it's done a lot of work with the Mysore traditions. He's done films and different conferences. And one of these people that he collaborates with is Dr. Sharma, who's still alive, and he was there as one of the boys in the Mysore Palace at the time. In fact, he's the boy that you see Krishnamacharya standing on in Kapotasana when you see the old tableau of Krishnamacharya and his troop. Sharma is the little boy that Krishnamacharya is standing on. And just for your peace of mind, Sharma said he didn't hurt at all. It was quite fine. Anyways, so Dr. Sharma said, well, after Surya Namaskar, every day when we came to practice with Krishnamacharya, we were free. We were free to do not as we pleased, but we were free to innovate, to experiment, to create, right? Krishnamacharya was teaching the boys dynamic asana, but he wasn't teaching them set sequences. So we really have to put that down to Pattabhi Jois, that he probably was helping Krishnamacharya at the demonstrations and they came up with various sequences, right? On the other hand, to extrapolate from the point of the Ashtanga, having these primary, intermediate, and advanced sequences, in the Yoga Sangalu, Krishnamacharya's second book, which was, I believe, 1948, I think. I find my notes around the 1940s anyway. The Yoga Sangalu was the second book he authored. I think I'm going to say 1944, but around that time. Anyways, so 1934, Krishnamacharya authored the Yoga Makaranda. 1940, I want to say 40, 48, but it might be earlier. Around the early 40s, he authored the Yoga Sangalu. And at that time, he does mention collections of postures, because in the Makaranda, he has some example sequences at the back. Yeah, but they're not the Ashtanga sequences. The postures look fairly similar. In the Sangalu, we find primary and intermediate and advanced groups at the back. And the postures are all roughly the same. They fit in the primary, the intermediate, advanced. The postures are the same in each grouping, but the sequence is not the same. The postures, I don't think Krishnamacharya was laying the postures out in a certain order either. All these asanas could be considered primary series asanas, all these asanas could be considered intermediate, and all these asanas could be considered the advanced ones. And so, inevitably, it seems like in the demonstrations, from these jumbles, they put together certain sequences. This is him and Pattabhi Jois, or maybe Pattabhi Jois as the leader of the troop sometimes. And from there was born the Ashtanga yoga that we know today. So it didn't come, sadly, from the Yoga Korunta. Probably, although I can't say for sure. It seems very unlikely, especially as when Krishnamacharya goes off after 1948, when funds are no longer there to run it's Indian independence at that time. Funds have been withdrawn because there's a political shift. The Maharaja of Mysore doesn't have that power anymore. And so the Mysore Palace closes. Krishnamacharya goes off to teach in Chennai, and he never teaches the jumping around of Ashtanga yoga. He never teaches the set sequences anymore. He teaches much more therapeutically, more slowly. And so if he was actually given these teachings of the Yoga Korunta by this Rama Mohan Brahmacharya in the early days, that would suggest that he would carry on teaching in exactly that way for his whole of his life. But for most of his life, of course, he doesn't teach this kind of dynamic Ashtanga kind of yoga whatsoever. And in the Mysore Palace, of course, we have record, someone like Sharma, TKV Sharma, saying that, well, they were free to experiment. They weren't having to follow set sequences. Nevertheless, you've got dynamic asana. You've got a whole bunch of postures that we do know. And yeah, you've got precedents. You've got precedents in the Mysore Palace library that Krishnamacharya probably borrowed from. Other aspects of physical culture. Probably, some people suggest that he actually borrowed from ideas of circus and contortionism. which is perhaps a challenging comment to some, but it's quite possible that Krishnamacharya had to keep innovating for these boys because one thing was that his asanas classes apparently weren't that popular compared to the gym next door. So you kind of feel that Krishnamacharya had to keep these boys and keep their attention, right, and keep giving them different things. But certainly they were given their own sequences. They weren't having to practice all the same thing, which kind of makes sense really, although a collective practice in Ashtanga yoga is also nice, and that's why I keep teaching it, as I've said many times, because there's something to do with a collective movement practice that we need these days. We lack that kind of communal endeavor. Anyways, that's a separate point, I suppose. Anyway, where was I? So yes, Krishnamacharya is teaching different things. He's teaching various asanas. He's teaching a dynamic asana, but it probably doesn't have a precedent prior to the 1850s currently, although there may be a text that goes back before the Hatha Abhyasa Paddhati. It hasn't been found yet, as I understand. So, nevertheless, Krishnamacharya bases his teaching always on three things: individual-based application of yoga. So every individual has to be treated as one, right? They have to be given their own thing, right? Their bodies are different, which unfortunately we seem to have lost in the modern day a little bit. Posture, counter posture. If you look at the Makaranda, Krishnamacharya is very, very careful to put posture, counter posture in every single asana progression he does, which we've again lost these days. And he rationalized that if you're engaging one set of muscles, to relax those set of muscles, you have to engage the opposite set of muscles. And it's very therapeutic for the body. Sadly, generally, we've kind of lost that. You've got a little bit of a trace of that in Ashtanga yoga with some posture, counter posture, but little. And finally, we've got the idea of building, Vinyasa Krama. They're building step by step in advanced, challenging postures, right? From simpler to more difficult. That kind of obviously makes sense. We kind of find that within Ashtanga somewhat, not completely. And those three things he did carry over, right? They were carried over to Krishnamacharya's later teaching. So, after that, after 1948, when the Yogashala in the Mysore Palace was closed down and Krishnamacharya went to teach in Chennai, what happened then? Right? Because we've kind of covered the basis a little bit of the postures, where they came from, the sequences, the Ashtanga sequences, where they came from, the Yoga Korunta. Well, actually, one more thing I wanted to say is that it's interesting how the myth of the Yoga Korunta builds up. So in the 1934 text of the Yoga Makaranda that Krishnamacharya authored as his first book, there's no trace of the Yoga Korunta. There's only a number. I mean, he mentions in the bibliography the Yoga Pradipika, Hatha Yoga Pradipika. I think he mentions the Tattvanidhi, the Hatha Abhyasa Paddhati might be mentioned there, but no Yoga Korunta. But by the Yoga Sangalu in the 1944 or 1948, again I can't remember the date, he's taken out the Tattvanidhi for some reason and started to insert the Korunta, right? So this idea that I suppose he wants to kind of make sure that the tradition has a deeper roots, I suppose, that it is not just something that he kind of cribbed from an 1800 text and made his own. Finally, I think before we move on, Vinyasa. People often say, well, where does this Vinyasa come from then? Because if static yoga was the thing before Krishnamacharya, like just posture by posture, and it wasn't really moving on that, the Paddhati has a little bit moving, and then you have this idea of Vinyasa. And again, Vinyasa is a great example of Krishnamacharya doing what has always been done in Indian traditional, I don't say culture there, in Indian traditional texts, let's say, which you take a term and you use it in a different way. So nothing has been changed, because you can't change anything that is essentially passed down by great sages or even divine intervention, right? You can't change anything in tradition, obviously. So what do? You use a term, that this is what Krishnamacharya did, and I think it's an interesting kind of representation of the way that he has modernized yoga, as you use a term, say Vinyasa. It comes from doing certain rituals at the right times, in a puja, in a prayer, right? And it's specifically mentally inserting mantras into the body. So you do a mantra and it goes in a certain place in the body. You focus on a certain place and you do your mantras, in different times of a ritual. And that was Vinyasa, special placement. People know that word. Vinyasa, place, special placement. Krishnamacharya uses this term for ritual, and he refers then to asanas, that doing asanas in a certain way, in a certain time, is Vinyasa. So he's not actually changed anything per se. He's using traditional Sanskrit terms, but of course he's used those terms to mean to be applied to mean new things. Again, why not? Why not? I mean, if we're looking at asana, modern asana as ritual and doing things very consciously with the breath, it's the very same thing as we've ever found in ritual traditions, conscious use of the mind and the body as one to come into a ritual space. You come into a ritual space when you do repetitive actions that involve mind and body in a certain order. Then you step outside time, which is always based on A to B material actions. Anyways, probably do another podcast on ritual at some point. But you can see the way that that there's the same terms, the old terms have been kind of reappropriated somewhat to mean new things. Not to say that they have been denigrated, have been corrupted in any way to mean as they mean new things, just simply that they have been used to express new ideas as we need to, because every tradition needs to keep evolving to suit the modern context. And that's, I think, a general driving force of the way I teach generally is like, well, we've got this tradition, and how do we make it appropriate and effective for us today, given that maybe we don't want to be doing Kundalini awakening anymore, and given also that we're not a 15 to 18-year-old Brahmin boy practicing in the Mysore palace, right? I mean, there's a lot to be said when you consider the fact that we don't generally have that age demographic, and yet we're still teaching in the way that Krishnamacharya taught those young boys, teaching extreme movement modality to adults that probably don't have necessarily the health, they certainly don't have the young body, and don't need to be doing such extreme things for their yoga. Perhaps we can still keep it Ashtanga. I don't think we need to throw the baby out with the bathwater personally, but these things have to be taken as the context from where and what we do. Otherwise, if you just look at the Yoga Korunta and a kind of magical spell of the Yoga Korunta, if you do it the same way, exactly the same way that Krishnamacharya apparently taught it, because he didn't, that's in the Yoga Korunta, then something will happen by doing this certain ritual or magic spell, which is a tempting thing to hang on to because it's an easy conclusion, and we like obvious conclusions, and we like the idea is attractive, of course, right? You just have to do it. You just have to practice exactly in that way. If you do it exactly in that way, then you'll get the benefits that will be given to you by a divine yoga god through your obedience to the Yoga Korunta. And it's a nice idea. I'm not saying it's not, and I believed it for many years because, I believe that there was this kind of certain energetic component, because there is, but the energetic component being specific to doing things in the exact order of Ashtanga yoga, which was never the case before Pattabhi Jois. So it doesn't mean that we can't be pragmatic, but still realize that the effects of yoga are very unpragmatic, very esoteric, very unbelievable in a certain way, whilst treating the actual asana practice itself as pragmatic. The two things aren't mutually contradictory. Anyway, having taken that little segue back to talk about something I forgot to talk about, where did it go from there? 1948, Krishnamacharya moves on. He moves on from the Mysore Palace, and he's forced to seek work and move his family to Chennai, further south in India. And at that point, he teaches adults, and he teaches very differently. You can look at the Gary Craftso podcast, which is maybe 6-8 months back. Maybe it's longer than that now. Gary Craftso was a student of Krishnamacharya's son, TKV Desikachar, and he talks about what Krishnamacharya taught them then, and it certainly isn't Ashtanga yoga. He says that Krishnamacharya uses a Sanskrit word for the yoga they learnt as yoga for joint stability, whereas the yoga that he taught the boys was something different. It was yoga for the Brahmin boys at that point of their life. So different kind of approaches to yoga that Krishnamacharya noticed himself. Anyway, so in 1948, Pattabhi Jois takes over Krishnamacharya's teaching in some way, and he teaches dynamic yoga, we believe, at the Sanskrit college in Mysore, because Pattabhi Jois taught as a Sanskrit professor there for many years. And he teaches from his home as well. And he teaches from 1948 to 1964 when André van Lisbeth is a Belgian guy, arrives. And he teaches this, and André van Lisbeth was the first Western student that somehow arrived at his doorstep, but not really a proper student of Ashtanga. Apparently, Pattabhi Jois did injure him, and not to say that that's why he stopped with Pattabhi Jois. He was actually much more interested in Shivananda yoga, and André van Lisbeth went on to author a couple of notable books on pranayama. Anyways, Van Lisbeth wrote a book called I Learn Yoga, J'apprends le Yoga, and in the back of that book he includes all the teachers that he had in India at that time. One of them is Pattabhi Jois. So that's one way that people learn to Pattabhi Jois Westerners from outside India learned of Pattabhi Jois. The other way was David Williams, Nancy Gilgoff, and Norman Allen. Well, David Williams and Norman Allen saw Manju Jois, Pattabhi Jois' son, do yoga demonstrations in Gitananda's ashram in Pondicherry in South India in the 1970s, early 1970s. And that's how they found their way to Pattabhi Jois's door to ask if he would teach them. Manju Jois said, "My dad will never teach you." But in the end, they kind of pestered Pattabhi Jois and he agreed. I mentioned that as a kind of roundup to the podcast because when David Williams, and David brought his girlfriend at that time, Nancy Gilgoff, the late Nancy Gilgoff, who sadly passed away last year, and they learnt a sequence which was, it was the Ashtanga sequence. It was pinned to the wall at the time, David Williams says, the Ashtanga syllabus, they called it, or curriculum. And it was the Ashtanga sequence, roughly speaking, but there were notable changes to it. One was that, and more in the delivery than what it actually was. So the curriculum is on the wall, but when David Williams arrives, there are local Indian people practicing with Pattabhi Jois in a much more relaxed fashion. They're not doing Ashtanga as we know it, They're using it. Again, the syllabus is there, but it's all in how it's used. And it wasn't used in that manner, so rigorously. So when David Williams arrives, he's really not finding the Ashtanga that we know today, just Pattabhi Jois kind of doing some yoga with Indian people. Not dynamic necessarily, not challenging. They're not young people, they're just normal professionals doing a bit of yoga, going to work, etc. And when they arrive, David Williams and Nancy, one difference is they're asked to spend at least 10 breaths in every posture, or they can do longer breaths or longer holds. It's not homogenized in the way that we have it these days. The practice is longer. They're also encouraged to do more rather than less. I think that's a really important detail that's been lost more recently. They're encouraged to do as much as they can, and they don't even know that there's two series, primary and second series. They just assumed that it was one long sequence because they were if they couldn't do one posture, they were given the next posture. They were helped with the last one. So there's that idea that, you've got all these postures, do the ones you can, try the ones you can't, and gradually you'll kind of pull it together as a whole, which has obviously changed in the past years, where if you can't do one posture, you have to stop there. And so people are giving this very kind of truncated and limited practices of just practice the primary series or half primary series and nothing else. Well, that certainly wasn't the way. When the first students learnt it, it was kind of like, well, do as much as you can. And Nancy Gilgoff famously said that Pattabhi Jois held her in all the postures because she wasn't strong enough to do any of them, right? Just encouragement, right? And obviously, I'm not saying it's wrong the way that Ashtanga's gone in the last years. It kind of had to go that way, given that there were so many other spin-offs of Ashtanga yoga, power yoga, Bikram. Well, Bikram's not a spin-off of Ashtanga, but other Vinyasa generally that were kind of taking Ashtanga principles and innovating upon them. So as other yogas came into the marketplace, of course, Ashtanga had to become more definitive, had to preserve its essence against these kind of challenges or potential corruptors of what it was. Right? So as other things spread out and kind of all these different yogas kind of evolved, Ashtanga, well, this is what we are, this is what Ashtanga is. And it became more legislated around that. And of course, then you had all the teachers coming back after a time and starting to put their pictures and their videos and the DVDs up. And then you had the homogenized version of the posture, which is very important because in the 70s, even when you see David Williams's chart, you can buy that chart from David Williams's website, the postures of Ashtanga, they're called the same things, but downward dog, his upward dog, they're very different. They don't look like the modern Ashtanga postures. But at that time, the names of the postures are all we have. Pattabhi Jois' curriculum pinned on the wall just has the names of postures. So the way people do them is obviously there's a lot more freedom to work with than now when we had the charts coming in the 80s. All these charts, you've got Sharat there, you've got Pattabhi Jois showing, exact nature of how the posture should be. Lino Miele was very much in the forefront of leading these charts and having the postures done in exactly the same way for everyone. So you see that gradually over the years, Ashtanga has also evolved. The whole of yoga has kept on evolving from Krishnamacharya's day to Pattabhi Jois, and then from Pattabhi Jois on to Sharat. To Sharat Jois, there's been a lot of innovation there as well in terms of just the kind of codifying, let's say, of what Pattabhi Jois taught even more. Right, well, I suppose I've probably talked enough for today, but I give you a basic overview of some ideas to think about anyway. And let me know what you think. As always, this is not meant to be a definitive academic guide to exactly what happened or how you should take your Ashtanga practice now, but I think it's good to know some of the context in which which our own modern practices have grown in today. to understand that, I think we can see ourselves in practicing something which is ancient, is involved with breath, involved in a certain kind of exerting certain muscular locks to engage pressure through the spine, which stimulates the spine. The idea of Kundalini in the first place was to force energy through the spine, and we're still kind of forcing energy through the spine, but in a modified, in a kind of lighter and more pragmatic way. And the way that you do that ultimately is, again, with the breathing. So the breathing and the bandha link us to tantric practices of Kundalini, but we're just doing it for slightly different ends, to awaken ourselves to let's say, a deeper sense of ourselves, a deeper sense of us and the world, a more aware sense of us, and also to deal with other unwanted emotional states that we increasingly suffer these days. We're probably not looking to do the tantric kind of practice, so we have to soften those techniques or slightly play around with them to affect what we want to do in the modern day, but the precedent is there. And of course then in the 1800s we have more asanas, so it definitely goes back from then, and even before that, of course, you could look at the Pashupati seal, which is often the claims of yoga go back to the seal, which is, if you don't know it, it's a figure sitting in a kind of siddhasana or a mulabandhasana, 2,000 years BCE, surrounded by animals. And this seal is where people say, it's definitely yoga, it's 5,000 years old. That's the idea, that it comes from this architectural settlements of Harappa and Mohenjo-daro that are prior to 5,000 years basically. But we don't really find that then conveyed in Vedic text, from then to Vedic text to classical text, so you can't see an obvious precedent developing from there. But we can definitely link what we're doing to the past, and of course it's all in the end of the day in intention. If our intention is to use the body as a valid vehicle for a deeper understanding of ourselves in life, a more meaningful existence, a deeper linking to a higher meaning, then, in my view, we're doing yoga, right? However we do it, the precedent shifts, right? The details shift, but the general precedent is always underlyingly the same, How we do it in specific ways will manifest in different ways, but the underlying intention to find a way to do some ritual practice that allows us to live in a deeper, meaningful way has always been the same. Anyways, I'll leave it there for now. I hope you've enjoyed the podcast. If not, I'm sorry about that, but you can look forward to another chat with a guest next week. I'm hoping to have a guest who will probably carry on from where I've left off in a similar vein. So let's see if I manage to pull that one off and enjoy the start of the new year. I hope you're getting on with the new year okay. I know it's been a challenging one, start of this new year, and let's hope it gets better from here. Anyways, if I don't see you around somewhere, I'll speak to you again next week. That's me from Keen on Yoga today, and I'll speak to you soon.